All right, geez, that was a little flurry of activity there, trying to get everything set up. My first lecture, we had our overhead projector didn't work, so I had to get this new one. It turns out it's like a whole graveyard for overhead projectors back there. But anyways, okay, so here we go. Today my plan is to talk a little bit about monetary policy, and maybe at the end of the lecture, segue a bit into modern macroeconomics, right? Some of the, and maybe one of the big concerns of modern macroeconomics, which builds a little bit upon everything that we've said up until this point. Okay, well, before I get into all that, a little bit on the bookkeeping side of things. Let me do this. I guess I can go to the slideshow here. So, one thing I will fix here is, for this class, I believe, our last class, of course, is December 12th, so that's a week from today. That is our review class, right? We'll do all of our stuff, reviewing for the final exam and all of the practice materials, which I will hand out next time, right? So today's Thursday. Tuesday, we'll have our last lecture. I'll hand out the practice materials. I'll get them back to you and all that stuff, and then we'll do our review Thursday. A week from next Thursday will be our final exam. Same format as before. There are the chapters, 2 problem sets. I'm going to post the last problem set number 11. I'll post that a little bit later today. Am I forgetting anything? We have a little bit of time to straighten out stuff about the format of the exam and all that. But suffice it to say, it'll be about the same as as it's been beforehand. Now, since we do have 2 hours instead of an hour and 15 minutes, I did say that I was going to maybe add an extra question or two onto that in-class component, so maybe we'll go with 12 instead of 10. But that's really the only big difference. Everything else will be exactly the same in terms of length and all that stuff. Oh yeah, and not cumulative. I know I've said it a couple of times here. The exam will only cover the stuff we've been talking about since the last exam, which is basically macroeconomics. Okay, catch my breath here. There's a lot of excitement there, fixing overhead projectors and, all this stuff. Anyways, so I'll dive right in here and remind you what we were talking about last time. Last time we discussed macroeconomic equilibrium, which is, maybe there's more to unpack there in that statement than immediately appears. If you remember, there were sort of 2 sides to macroeconomic equilibrium. Looking at my second bullet point first, there were these short-run equilibria, right, where demand and supply, aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersect, and they may or may not coincide with what is something like a long-run equilibrium, which is the potential, right, of the economy. Same as the long-run supply, the potential we treat as basically the same thing. Why do we do that? Well, we had this justification that leans on Say's law, right, this idea that supply ultimately creates its own demand. What I mean by that is the supply of inputs, right, to an economy ultimately create the demand for the output, right? And over a significant period of time, we would expect those things to balance, right? So the fact that you go to work, you own some property, land, things like this that you lease to businesses, you supply your labor, you get income from all of that, right? Well, what do you do with that income? You turn around and buy things. In fact, you buy the things that you participate in the making of, right? And so in the end, we would expect that the fact that you're supplying the inputs creates ultimately the demand for what those inputs create. And we gave arguments using the price of inputs and the slack of the economy that would suggest that over time, prices adjust so that, in fact, this overall supply of inputs equals the supply of output, or the demand for output. Okay, so with all that in mind, we did say that sometimes aggregate demand and aggregate supply don't do exactly what we want to. By that I mean they don't get us to potential. And so what we would like to do is engage in policy maybe to keep aggregate demand and aggregate supply crossing close to potential. And what we'd like to do while we're keeping GDP near this potential is do so in such a way so that we don't screw up prices too much. That is to say, so that we don't cause inflation or create inflation. Or we also want to do this while keeping inflation low, right? So we have this dual objective And we saw that in some sense these objectives might be not in complete alignment, to the degree that higher demand tends to push up prices. At the same time, it creates higher output, right? So those are the things that we have to work with. And so our policy comes from the idea that these natural adjustments, right, these Say's law type things, might not work the way we want to, so we engage in policy, right? Little example of how this might happen in practice. Well, here I just have my aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram, and I've drawn this, I guess you could say, this shift back in aggregate demand. So you might think about this as some sort of event comes along and upsets our economy, right? Something happens in a stock market, people lose faith in stocks, and they say, well, the economy's not going to look good in the future, we're not going to invest as much. This fall in I might lead to aggregate demand shifting back, right? And creating an equilibrium where aggregate demand and aggregate supply are intersecting somewhere below potential, right? And that's what I mean by this output gap here. So this is a recessionary story, and of course I've given you a couple of examples here. Investment problems, or problems with investment markets, I should say, were to some degree the cause of the Great Depression, right? The proximate cause. The same is true of the housing bubble that popped in 2008, right? And so, long story short, we wind up with, I guess you could say, deficient aggregate demand. Well, our natural adjustment story would be, well, when this is true, right, people lose their jobs, businesses, fail, shop fronts are open, there is slack in the economy, right? People are not using resources they otherwise would use. So the prices of these things should go down, and as prices go down, supply shifts, and that should put us back at potential, right? Of course, the alternative is to use some sort of policy to get us back there. And this is how that might work, or at least as we understand it, as we talked about last time, fiscal policy, right? So what happens here? Well, aggregate demand falls for all of those reasons maybe that I described previously. And then what we can do is we can say, oh, well, let's have a tax cut, or let's have some increased government expenditures, right, as we did with the Inflation Reduction Act. And that would create this change in E, this positive change in government expenditures, and maybe shift our blue line to the purple line, right? And you can see the equilibrium sliding closer to potential. Well, once we inject this initial money into the economy, then the circular flow kicks in and creates a multiplier effect, right? As we described last time. The money that we spend as the government goes to people, right, who then spend it on goods, right? They go to buy groceries and, automobiles and all that stuff. Well, the people who sell groceries and automobiles now have more money themselves. So they go spend that, so on and so forth, and that gives us this multiplier effect, which hopefully propels us all the way back to potential GDP again, right? And so once again, we phrased this as, while we expect that we'll get back there automatically, we're not so certain about the time frame, right? Maybe it's just going to take too long to do that. So time horizons matter to mere mortals like us, and so maybe we can do better with a little bit of policy, get back more quickly. And obviously, we talked about how the Great Depression was lasting quite some time before the World War II, or the big expenditures associated with World War II kind of closed the gap. Well, there's another alternative policy that we might actually employ to stabilize the economy. That is to say, to get the economy to work so that, or closer to potential. And this involves monetary policy, right? So monetary policy, I guess that's the generic name for things the Federal Reserve does, right? Or things that happen in financial or money markets that influence the real economy, right? Inflation and unemployment. And largely, or almost entirely, monetary policy is the purview of the Federal Reserve Bank in the United States, right? And you might be shocked to know that the Federal Reserve is really an independent entity, right? It's not part of the federal government. It's chartered by the government, but it's not technically part of it, meaning it's not under the jurisdiction of Congress or the president directly. Of course, as I'll talk about in a second, some of its organizational structure depends upon what the president does. But beyond that, it basically functions with a mandate independently from the rest of the government. So here, I call that the dual mandate, and you can kind of think of this dual mandate. Well, it was part of the Fed's charter in 1913, I think. I'll get to that in a second. And it says that the Federal Reserve should control the money supply in the United States. Money supply is really what it controls, thinking a lot about interest rates. But what it has in mind is keeping inflation low and keeping unemployment low, right? That is to say, keep the economy at potential and keep the inflation rate down. Those are its two jobs, its two mandates. Usually we think about the Fed as controlling interest rates to achieve these objectives, right? So the federal funds rate is the main rate that the Federal Reserve controls. And here's a little picture of said rate from January 06 to the present, basically. And you can see that this rate has fluctuated over time. The federal funds rate is actually a very particular interest rate. It's the overnight rate that that banks charge each other based, when they lend each other reserves, right? What are reserves? Well, that's the cash that banks have on hand at any given time. And yes, at the end of the day, they're supposed to have a certain amount of reserves, right? They're required by law to have a certain amount of reserves. So just when you go through your business and you're a bank during the day, you might wind up, somebody comes in and makes a big withdrawal. You have fewer reserves than you need. Well, you can borrow some from a bank that has more than it needs, right? And the federal funds rate is the rate at which this borrowing occurs. And so we talk about the Fed as having control over this rate. So you can see that it has some interesting behavior. Not so long ago, it was at 5%, a little bit above. Then, of course, we had the big meltdown in mortgage markets, and you can see what happened to the rate, really what I should say, what the Fed did with the rate. And you can also see what happened here in the COVID episode, what the Fed did with the rate there. And what it's doing now with rates. So you might sort of ask yourself, well, why did it drop rates during these two downturns in economic activity? Why is it increasing rates now? Some good motivating questions here. A slightly longer look will provide us a little bit more data. As we've kind of said, as I guess I've said about macroeconomics in this class in general, one thing I'm trying to do at the same time as I sort of explain the theories is just give you a little bit of a sense as to what the facts look like, right? So this is maybe a picture you might have in your mind when you think about Federal Reserve policy in regards interest rates over time. And you can see this is like a 40-year snapshot. At one time, the Federal Reserve held rates at quite high levels, right? Above 18%. That seems like an enormous interest rate by today's standards. And indeed, not too long ago, we had rates close to zero, right? The federal funds rate was close to zero, right? It's hard to even imagine an interest rate lower than that. So what's going on there? Okay. Now, of course, we've talked about the interest rate, and I've sort of said that the Fed has done things with it to accomplish certain things. That's not entirely speaking exactly what the Fed does. What the Fed actually does is manipulates the money supply, right, in such a way so that the interest rate responds, right, in a particular fashion. And the Fed's real instrument of control is this money supply, right? And what do I mean by money supply? Well, there's a lot of different things you can mean when you say money supply. It's basically the amount of cash that's out there in circulation, the dollars that are out there in circulation, I should say. Not just cash, because money that's in a checking account counts as well. And in fact, some other things all factor into this money supply. I'd love to go into all the details. There's different ways of measuring how much money is actually out there. That's a great subject for Eco 210, money and banking, which I'm assuming you'll all take at some point, right? And you go deep into the weeds in a lot of these details with that stuff. So the Fed controls this amount of cash that's out there in circulation in a very particular fashion, and it thereby influences interest rates. So just to give you a little bit more detail, I've kind of said some mysterious things about the Fed. Maybe I should have held off until this slide here. The Federal Reserve itself is actually composed of 12 member banks, and they're basically distributed in the major financial centers of the United States. Founded in 1913. The key policy arm of the Fed is the Federal Open Market Committee, right? Has 12 members, some of whom are presidents of the member banks, one of whom is the president, right, of the Fed. Is that the right word? I should know that. Right, Jerome Powell, right, is our guy currently, and so he's sort of in charge of this committee. They get together a couple of times a year, 8 times I think a year, and they decide what they're going to do in general with monetary policy, with the supply of money, with the idea in mind of changing interest rates. So I did say that they're not under control of Congress, but the Fed, the presidents of each of the Fed banks are appointed by the president for fairly long terms, a little bit like a judge, right? Something like that. Okay, and once again, the institutional details are fascinating, and I'd love to talk about them at length, but of course we only have a class or two left to talk about all of this. So I'm going to cut to the chase and give you a description of the basic mechanics of how all this works, right? And so really it's a somewhat complex process that has these various steps to it, but ultimately what happens is the Fed changes the money supply around, right, the amount of cash in circulation, in a way that influences this federal funds rate, right? This federal funds rate, well, it turns out it's an important interest rate. Most other interest rates follow suit. So where this rate goes, other rates go, right? So through this means the Fed influences interest rates in general, right? And by that I mean the rates that you pay your bank when you get a homeowner's loan, the rates that you pay for your credit card, right? The prime rate, all of these things sort of, you go buy a car, what sort of financing, what rate you get on the financing. All of these rates tend to go up and down with the Federal Reserve, with the federal funds rate. So interest rates go up or down following this rate, and that in turn influences economic activity, right? Right, the amount of spending that people do depends a little bit upon interest rates, at least in an important dimension. So my plan is to just kind of go through these steps and then show you what the pictures look like. And then we can sort of think about why one would prefer this means of policy to some other means. So maybe I'll start at the end here. Higher interest rates mean less, how economic activity depends upon interest rates. And the basic idea is that higher interest rates mean less economic activity, right? And you might say, well, what do you mean by that? I like it when my interest rate is high. I go to the bank and my savings account has a high interest rate. I save more. Well, that's true, but if you think about how people behave when they have to make decisions about spending money as they depend upon interest rates, that's really what concerns us here. So I have a little bit of an example that maybe reflects the big concerns here. And I'm trying to make things sound maybe a little bit fancier than they are, but that's part of talking about macroeconomics, right? Using the terminology and all of that. So what I have here is, the scenario is maybe this is an automobile manufacturer. It's sort of looking at the horizon off into the future, and it's saying, all right, here's the business climate. We have certain projects that we could engage in. Should we go ahead and do these projects? So maybe what happens is this, you work for this auto company, you've graduated with your major in economics, you know your econometrics and your macro, your micro and all that stuff. And so you're in charge of kind of doing the numbers, forecasting out what's going to happen off into the future, right, for these projects that this business could engage in, right? So here I have some of these projects that our automobile maker might engage in. This is the investment expenditure. And so you can think about, this is the thought process of the business. It says, all right, well, let's see. If I build this new battery plant, electric battery plant, my finance people tell me that we can expect a rate of return or a return on this investment of 10%, right? A 10% return on the investment of building battery plant, and it'll cost us $100 million or whatever to build. So if I'm the CEO of this company and I'm given this 10% number, I then say to myself, okay, well, let's see. In one scenario, maybe I just have the money sitting there, right? I have $100 million, and the question is, do I spend it on this investment? And the relevant comparison I will make is I will look at the interest rate, right, in the market, and I'll look at my internal rate that I can earn, or my rate of return on investment, and whatever's higher, that's what I'll do. So what I'm saying is, if I can get better than 10% in the market, I'll just save the money in the market, right? If I don't get 10% in the market, I'll invest it in this project, right? And so in this way, you can see here my example. If the market rate of interest is 12% and the rate of return on my project is 10, well, why would I do it? I'll just save the money. I don't need to build that. I don't need to undertake that project. Of course, it doesn't have to be the case that I have the money sitting there in my, in the accounts of the business. It could also be a matter of borrowing, right? We've crunched all the numbers. We figure out that the return on investment here is 10%. Well, if the interest rate's less than 10%, then we should borrow the money, right, and build the plant. Okay? Because whatever it is, if we borrow it at, say, what is my example here, 6% maybe, well, then building the plant, borrowing, we get 10 minus 6, 4% return on our investment, even though we have to pay interest on the money we've borrowed. So what we do is we compare the return on our investments with the actual going interest rate in the market, and if the return is higher, we invest. So at the end of the day, you can kind of see what happens. When interest rates are high, we wind up undertaking less projects, right? There's fewer projects that are worth it, strictly speaking, at any given market rate of interest when it's high. If the interest rate comes down, now these projects make sense, right? Now the return on investment justifies making the project or borrowing the money even to make the project at low interest rates. And you can probably think of examples where you'll engage in economic activity based upon just thinking about what the market rate of interest is. So maybe you're not to the point where you're buying a house and looking at homeowners loans, right? Or buying a car and thinking about taking out a loan to do that. I don't know. You'll be more likely to do that at lower interest rates, right? But you might even think about your own education, right? So, I don't know if you think about it exactly this way, but you might say, well, what is the return on the investment that I get from making an education or getting education, right? Maybe it's X. Well, how much do I pay if I borrow to do this, right? I have to think about the interest rate on my loans. If the return on the investment is higher than the interest rate on the loans, then I should go to college. And you wind up with this idea that if the cost of the loans is too high, maybe you don't get as much education as you otherwise would, right? So that's the idea, and if you sort of parse this out, you wind up with this. We love this curve here because it accentuates a certain feature of that argument that I just presented. So think about it this way: when the market interest rate is R1, well, the only projects that make sense to this business or businesses in general are these that are from here to here. Those are the ones that generate returns higher than R1, right? And of course, if R should fall to R2, well, then all these additional projects now make sense. And of course, that means that investment expenditures are increasing as interest rates go down, right? So you can even think about it this way: the cost or the price of making an investment, right, in a project, or investing if you're a business, right, spending money on creating future returns, it only makes sense or makes more sense at lower interest rates, right? That's kind of the idea here. So these interest rates are prices of investing, right? Maybe even the opportunity cost of investing. And of course, you can apply the same exact argument to consumers. People are more likely to buy things, to borrow, maybe to buy things at lower interest rates. So that's kind of the link here. Lower interest rates mean more economic activity, right? And of course, if we get rid of all these other letters and just look at the I here, the lower interest rate is, we're actually drawing a link between interest rates and I in our C plus I plus G, one of the important components of aggregate demand. So lower R, lower interest rates, more I, right? More aggregate demand. Okay, so that's kind of the last chain of right there, right? The very last arrow bullet point there is economic activity goes up or down with the interest rates, like that. Okay, so how does the Fed actually manipulate interest rates? I said it had something to do with, the Federal Open Market Committee. Why is it called that? That's the policy arm of the Fed. It manipulates interest rates, but does so through this money supply channel. How does it go about doing that? Well, we'll think about it. We'll describe the steps here, and then we'll sort of show you what all the pictures look like when we put it all together. Essentially, it's manipulation of the money market, and here what I mean by the money market is the market for holdings of cash, right? Or cash and money in bank accounts, rather than some other sort of asset, right? It manipulates that market. Effectively, the Federal Reserve has control of the money supply. What does that mean? It means it can print money whenever it wants to, right? It's kind of weird that it's just sitting there independent from the rest of government. By the way, there's a lot of reasons why we like that, but there it is, the Fed, independent from the rest of government, and it can arbitrarily print money or destroy it whenever it wants to, right? Our currency, the dollars that you hold in your pocket. So that's where the money supply comes from. The demand for money comes from people's desire to hold cash instead of other things, right? Now, the way we think about this as economists, you might have to sort of think about businesses as being holders of cash. They're the ones who hold enormous amounts of money. But you can think about it on a personal level if it's easier to understand. So you think about it this way: you want to have a certain amount of cash on hand, right? Indeed, if you ever go to a financial planner or become one yourselves, that's what they tell you. They're like, well, you need to have this amount of cash around just in case, right? You should have $10,000 in cash if you can, at all times. And the idea is that you might need that to pay for things, unforeseen circumstances, bills, whatever, take advantage of some opportunity that comes along, I don't know, right? You need that cash on hand. But the problem is cash does not bear interest, right? And in fact, you get angrier and angrier about holding that cash, the higher and higher and higher is the interest rate, right? Because you're foregoing the chance to earn something. And so that's the basic idea here, is that people want to hold cash, and the interest rate kind of keeps them from doing it, right? It's the price of holding money, effectively. So at lower interest rates, people are more willing to hold cash. At higher interest rates, people and businesses are less willing to hold cash. And out of this, we can think about there being some demand for cash holdings out there, which the Fed controls. So if we put this all together, we wind up with something that kind of looks like this. Here's a money market, right? And so here we have the money supply, as I say here, chosen by the Federal Reserve. And here we have a money demand curve, which embodies that logic that I just discussed, right? And you can kind of see what happens. If the Federal Reserve wants to lower the interest rate, well, it can expand the supply of money, right? There's a lot of cash out there. People don't want to hold it if the interest rate is high. The interest rate has to come down then to induce people to hold the cash. Might be the way you understand this. The opposite is true here at this point. Right here, when the money supply is low, well, you can see the interest rate has to come up. Or the interest rate is high, I'm sorry, when there isn't much cash around there. Essentially what happens is there's not enough cash at the rate RE. People want more cash at this rate than there is, so what happens is the rate has to go up, right, to make sure that people's demand for money and the supply coincide. So the Fed expands the money supply or contracts the money supply, and we slide up and down this money demand curve based on that. And you can see the interest rates kind of bounce up and down accordingly. Kind of weird, right? That's how it works. And it gets even weird. I mean, when you think about how the Fed actually does this, it gets even maybe a little bit weirder. I guess it could be weird, not as weird as it actually is. It could be the case that the Fed just prints up a block of dollars and throws them on the street or something, right? That would be kind of like, back in the, Renaissance or the Age of Exploration when new gold came in from overseas. But the Fed actually has a very particular way of changing around the money supply. It buys and sells government securities from banks, right? So banks, typically hold all kinds of assets. They have to hold a certain amount of cash by law. They need some reserves, right? That's why they borrow and lend reserves, overnight and all that stuff. They need to have a certain amount of reserves. And the government the Federal Reserve manipulates that fact, right, by buying and selling things from its member banks, typically. So what does it buy and sell? It buys and sells something that there are a lot of out there in the economy. These are government securities, right? So we've talked about in previous classes the size of the government debt. It's very large, right? How does the government finance that debt? It sells securities. So, when you go out and buy a government bond, right, you're in effect lending the government money. So how does that bond work? Well, you buy it for some price today, right? And then at the end of some period of time, it gives you a sum of money back, right? That's what's printed on the bond. So it might be $10,000. You go out, you lend the government money by buying that at, say $9,500 today. And then at the end of the maturity period, you get the money back. But in the meanwhile, you've lent the money that you have to the government. So there are enormous amounts of these things out there, and everybody holds a little bit of them. And there are actually there are a bunch of different types of government securities out there. Once again, it's interesting to contemplate why there are so many different types of government securities and what they do and how they're interrelated. I wish we had time for that. Luckily, even though we don't have the time, we have many courses on these subjects, right? Like financial markets and institutions, money and banking, all that stuff. Anyways, so for our purposes, there are treasury bills, notes, and bonds. The bills are the short-term ones. Those are ones that if you buy them today, within the next year, they will hit their maturity date, and then you'll get your money back from the government, or you'll get the promised amount of money back from the government. And those are the ones that the Fed typically buys and sells to manipulate the money supply. So what it does to complete these transactions is it says, all right, banks, we're going to buy, 100 million treasury bills. Maybe you've graduated with your degree in economics. You go to work for the Fed. You want to get a certain interest rate effect, and you determine that you need 100 million treasury bills to do this, to get the interest rate to move in a certain way. So the Fed decides that that's what they're going to do is buy 100 million of these things. What happens? They go out, buy the bills. The banks give them the treasury bills, turn them over to the Fed. And then the Fed says, okay, well, what we're going to do is, we're going to credit your account with some cash, right? That's just like having money in the bank, no pun intended. It's as good as cash for you, but we're just going to do it with a couple keystrokes here, plus, price of bills. There you go, bank. Now you have more money, right? So what happens now is the bank has more cash, right, as far as it's concerned, on its books. And then it can go about the business of lending that cash out, so it eventually trickles out all over the place, expanding the money supply. Money supply expands out, right? Interest rates drop, economic activity increases, right? And I'll show you what the pictures look like. But that's what it does. It buys government bonds, or government bills, T-bills, to expand the money supply. And it does so by taking bills, or taking one asset from the banks, right, and giving them cash in place of that asset. Doesn't actually have to give them cash, but it could, right? That is to say, the Fed could print out print out some hundreds and ship them off. It doesn't do that because these days electronic money is as good as any, right? So boom, that's how the money supply is expanded. Of course, the opposite is also true. If the Fed wanted to make the money supply smaller, well, why would it do that? Well, shrink the money supply, interest rates will go up, right? More, and I'll show you all the pictures in a second. What would it do to do that? Well, it would, instead of buying bills, it would sell them. So what does the sale do in this case? It says we have these treasury bills, we're going to sell 100 million of them. Here you go, banks. The banks would then say, okay, well, we'll buy some of those. Here's the cash for them. We'll take the bills. Now the banks have bills instead of cash, right? They have to have a certain amount of cash on hand, so they wind up starting to call in loans and all that stuff and pulling cash out of the system, right, to get their reserves back up to where they should be. So the Fed changes assets into cash by buying things, right? It changes cash into assets by selling things. And according, so the buying and selling goes, so goes the supply of money, right? So if we expand the supply of money, what we want to do, buy some T-bills, interest rates will come down because of that money market. That'll increase investment, and that will, through this drop of the interest rate. So you can see here we're getting the end of the semester. My graphs are now, they're getting, the quality is going downhill rapidly. But I thought I would put together a picture of all of these markets kind of operating in sequence. And you can kind of see how it goes here. So here we have the money supply and the money demand function that we described, right? The equilibrium interest rate. And of course, we can go over here and we can say, all right, well, there's a demand for investment projects here. All of those for which the rate of return is higher than the interest rate will happen, and that creates this level of investment. This level of investment then puts us on our aggregate demand curve, which is, once again, you can think about as being C plus I plus G. And here, happily, everything is kind of making sense because aggregate demand and aggregate supply are crossing right at potential, right? Okay. So we might imagine, I kind of wish I had drawn this differently, like maybe, investors get spooked because of, they're worried about financial markets and or the quality of the investments that they're getting in mortgage markets, whatever. So investment maybe shifts back and aggregate demand shifts back, and we might wind up with ourselves in a position like this, right? So here we have an interest rate and a level of investment, but now aggregate demand coming from this investment is low, and we're in a recession, right? We're intersecting below potential, okay? So the Federal Reserve maybe sees this and says, all right, well, we can, what's wrong with this? Yeah, the policy prescription, not prescription. Medicinal there. Anyways, so what the Fed might do now is, you guessed it, might say, all right, well, we'd like to engage in expansionary policy, by which we mean expanding the money supply to result in a drop in the interest rate, more investment, and a shift out in aggregate demand, right? So it would look something like this, where my red line now is where the Fed shifts out the money supply. How do they do this, by the way? Once again, they buy bonds from member banks. They buy some bonds, shift this out. The Fed, by the way, knows basically what this curve looks like. So they're able to get this, they're able to figure out how many more, what this expansion must look like to get a certain change in R here, right? Well, when they get that change in R, they get some change in I, and of course then aggregate demand will shift back out again, right? So that's kind of the money, the expansionary monetary policy, or the policy of easy money, as you might say. Why is it easy? Just because they've made more of it available in this way of thinking about things. I was going to add something about that. Right. So oftentimes you hear this discussed in terms of basis points. Right. The Federal Reserve is lowering the interest rate by 50 basis points or 25 basis points. That's 0.25 of a percentage point, right, in interest. And like I say, the Fed understands this diagram well enough so that they can change the money supply to get the basis points that they're after. So I'll get to that in a second. I thought maybe what I do is I just draw up the contractionary monetary policy case. So maybe I can draw that up for you here on this. We'll see if this overhead projector works. Maybe I should have. Well, it's a little dim, but the good news is it might show up good in video. So All right, so the way I would do this is I might kind of start off by rigging the system to show you a situation where some sort of contractionary, right, monetary policy might be necessary. So, for example, maybe our economy, here's output, here's potential, price level. Maybe our economy is starting at a point like this, right, where now you can see aggregate demand and aggregate supply are intersecting above potential. And so this is a concern. Yeah, it looks terrible. Oh well. This is a concern, by the way, not just because, maybe prices are high because aggregate demand is high, but of course we expect that maybe the natural adjustment will start kicking in, and this will create even more inflation, right? So we might be worried about all of that stuff. So as a result, the Federal Reserve wants to engage in some sort of contractionary policy here. So what would that be like? Well, let me draw these other diagrams here. They're not going to look as nice as not that they look that nice on my previous slide. So here we have the money supply, money demand, equilibrium interest rate here, and we can draw our investment demand curve here. This interest rate comes over and determines I for us, which then goes into aggregate demand. So the Fed now is saying, oh no, it looks like people are getting a little crazy in the financial markets. They think the future is really great. Investment is just too high, and this is leading to aggregate demand, or these expenditures are a little bit too exuberant. Aggregate demand is too high. We want to put the brakes on this process a little bit. Let's engage in contractionary monetary policy, by which I mean shifting back the money supply, right? So what would this involve? Selling bonds, right? Or selling bills, I'm sorry. And when the banks buy these bills, well, they've now acquired an asset and they've given up some cash. System-wide, the amount of cash out there has to go down. Interest rates will go up like this, right? We'll slide back on our investment curve, and with a little bit of luck, we'll get aggregate demand to shift back, staving off the inflationary pressure, right? And so that's pretty sad, but hopefully, pretty sad presentation there, but hopefully you get the idea. Okay, so that's kind of this picture in reverse. So here's a nice little simplified, group of arrows summarizing the chain of events. We have expansionary monetary policy. That means M goes up. That pushes interest rates down. More investment and also more consumption, right? People are more likely to spend money too. And that, of course, shifts out aggregate demand, resulting in more real GDP and higher prices. And everything is in reverse in this contractionary monetary policy setting, as I've drawn it. So really, this whole picture,
Sorry, in the last diagram, what did the C represent?
The C represents consumption expenditures by consumers. Consumer consumption, so we get the double C there.
All the graphs.
Okay, so there, see, aggregate demand, the components are C, I, and G, right? Does that help?
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. No, I probably should have labeled those diagrams a little bit more. Okay, so here's the classic picture if you want to think about, now that we're, this is exactly like the fiscal policy picture I gave you, right, where we have aggregate demand. But here, there's the steps 1 and 2 there on my previous slide, where the money supply expands, say, and interest rates go down. Now we just have this change in I here. Those interest rate changes induce a change in investment, and that shifts us out to this purple line here. Well, this change in investment expenditures behaves exactly as a change in government expenditures now, right, in this model. And it's subject to multiplier effects too, and ultimately, these multiplier effects ricochet throughout the economy and get us out to this new aggregate demand curve, right? So at this point, it looks exactly, it does exactly the same things as expansionary fiscal policy. So, one thing you can sort of, if you wanted to summarize all of this, you could say, the Fed should make, easy money goes along with recessions. And I don't know if harder money is the right thing to say, but you might say contractionary monetary policy goes along with inflation, right? Put another way, the Fed likes low interest rates in bad times and high interest rates in good times, right? The easy money part of it can't be understated. So this was a big part in the mortgage meltdown in 2008. This was a big part of policy, right? Was the Fed was like, we're going to go in there, we're going to, make sure banks have reserves, we're going to make banks, loans and cash plentiful and easy to get, as banks are, people were, wondering if the banks were going to make it. Maybe people are running on the banks, trying to get their cash out before the bank fails, right? That's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the idea was to make cash easy to get, easy money, right? Low interest rates, and that was a big part of our response to the crisis in 2008. And that was largely a product of this theory, right? But this theory was developed subsequent to the Great Depression and a lot of the previous crises that had happened in the economy, which reacted in a very different fashion, right? In the Great Depression, you may or may not know how the story went. It was kind of a, we had the stock market crash and then just cascades of banks failing. And the Fed's response was to kind of just, turtle up and stand out of the way and be tight with its money and let the banks go under and all of that stuff. And we now believe that this exacerbated the Great Depression. And of course, the theory here suggests that the Fed's response should have been the opposite, right? It was at that time that we needed to have easy money for banks and everyone out there, right? So this is, I guess you could say, a harder theoretical lesson here. So when you think about this, and you think about that picture that I showed you at the beginning of class, this is a little bit of a confusing graph, but it maybe suggests what exactly the Fed was trying to accomplish with its policies throughout, well, here I have 1970 to 2014. The most recent period isn't in there. But, we'll get to that in a second. So you can see here the solid line is the federal funds rate. The inflation rate is the solid dashed line, and then the dashed line is the unemployment rate. You can see here that throughout the 70s we had pretty high inflation. It really spiked in the late 70s. And the Fed accordingly pushed up the federal funds rate, right? Very contractionary monetary policy, resulting in a really high federal funds rate. Well, why was this the case? It's because the inflation rate was out of control, right? And the Fed was trying to combat inflation. Well, as the 80s proceeded, the Fed became more concerned, and inflation was under control, became more concerned with the high unemployment. And you can see that the federal funds rate is, well, not always going down, but is kind of going down throughout the whole 80s, 90s. Maybe at the end of this episode 2 here, the Fed is getting concerned a little bit about inflation. It moves the interest rate up a little bit. And then, of course, there was a recession at the beginning of the 90s. So the federal funds rate comes down, right? You can see there's unemployment there to combat that unemployment. And, into the roughly the more modern period, we had a bit of a booming period in the late the 2000s after the dot-com bubble burst. Well, and then you can see here 2008, there was this enormous spike in unemployment. That was, again, the mortgage crisis. And you can see what the Fed's response was. It was to lower the interest rate, or the federal funds rate, basically to zero, right? And it stayed there for a while. Recently started to creep up again, but actually, I wonder if we can just take a look at this. You can see the recent history here. It was basically at zero for a long time to combat essentially this hangover after that mortgage crisis. So now it's down at zero, and this, of course, is it's a little bit controversial. It's close to zero, not exactly there. People were worried about this because people have suspected that interest rates can't really go below zero. That would be weird, wouldn't it? You're better off just keeping your money in your mattress at that point. Because if you put it in the bank is going to take a little bit of it every year at a negative interest rate. Weird. Okay. So this kind of echoes this idea that we're talking about on the fiscal policy side. And we kind of summarize the whole picture here as follows, the whole policy picture, in that if you think about a recession, the idea is expansion, right? Fiscal policy, what we want to do is spend more than we take in, right? Increase G or decrease taxes, T. We do that automatically through unemployment and all that stuff. And then monetary policy, the correct monetary policy might be to lower interest rates, right? Easy money, if you want to think about it that way. And that causes an expansion as well. The inflation, we want to do the opposite, right? Keep interest rates higher, but tight money, that's the word I was looking for. How could I not think of that? Contractionary, I kept saying, tight money, right? That keeps interest rates higher. It keeps people from spending too much, right? And of course, fiscal policy would be kind of not spending or spending less, through government policy. And you often characterize all of this as leaning against the wind, right? When things are going badly, you push the economy forward. And when things are going, when they're going too well, you want to pull back a little bit, right? So one thing I didn't mention on this slide is why you might prefer one means of policy instead of another. There are a couple of practical concerns. I guess monetary policy is, because the Fed is able to control things so tightly, for day-to-day stuff it's probably better. And it can react to just about anything very quickly. I mean, that was kind of implicit in my little discussion of Fed policy over the last 40 years or so, right? Or 50 years. The Federal Reserve can react quickly to various things and all of that, and that's great. But it's hard for the Fed to react in a big way to some serious crisis. And maybe that's more the purview of fiscal policy, right? Of course, fiscal policy has to go through Congress, and that makes it a little bit more cumbersome, right? You can't just one day decide to do fiscal policy and have it, pass the law, and then boom, there goes the money, right? It takes a little while to get all the legislation through that is required. So each has their kind of place and their advantages, but they can also, there's some overlap in what these things can do. And of course, the ultimate aim of fiscal and/or monetary policy is to just try and keep aggregate demand and aggregate supply intersecting as close as possible to potential. And that's fine. But there actually are a couple of caveats here, things that we're going to have to think about. And there are these continuing problems with everything here. So one of which is this natural adjustment process, right? I've said, well, it looks great when I draw it up on the projector, and I talk about how input prices start going up, maybe to close a recession, and we creep back to potential. Well, that's kind of a complicated process, right? And indeed, expenditures in general, when people are making decisions about what to buy and when to buy it and all that stuff, complicated stuff. Every crisis is a little different. We don't quite know how the timing is going to work out. We don't know any of these things, right? And so how this process actually works is a little bit mysterious. And we're going to talk about one aspect which makes it even more mysterious in great detail next time. The other thing you might have wondered is, why not just have an accelerationist policy? And this is something like, maybe you've heard of modern monetary theory. How many people have heard of that, by the way? All right, maybe you haven't. I guess it kind of came and went. It was a big thing before we had this recent inflation. And the idea was just that the government should just keep spending money because it can print it. That was in a nutshell, right? If the government can print money, why not just print and spend to keep the economy at or above full employment, right? All the time. So I can even show you what it might look like in a graph. It's kind of an interesting. So in a graph, you might sort of say, well, let's see, here's aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Maybe we're at potential. That's good, but you know what's even better than being at potential? is being above potential, right? And so how might we do that? Well, we just crank up aggregate demand like this, right? And then Baker says, well, you know what, you can't keep doing this, or you can't maintain this, because what will happen is the economy will start to adjust back towards potential, right? So maybe aggregate supply starts creeping back like this. But then you know what you could do? You could just spend some more, right? And then instead of creeping back this way, you're going here. And then when it starts to creep back again, you spend some more, right? And then look what happens. We're always above potential. I mean, we're getting inflation, but above potential, right? So we're operating above capacity all the time. That's got to be a good thing, right? Most of us suspect there's something wrong with that argument, right? And it actually does have a little bit to do with, we're missing something about how price adjustments occur. I'll get to this in a second. And maybe even this supposition that, you know, our oldest theory is actually not so bad over significant periods of time. This quantity theory, right? At the end of the day, money is just paper, right? So how can it actually be doing anything? If you just sort of mechanically think about the amount of money people want to spend, right? How fast it can change hands. Well, in the end, it seems like the prices should just adjust to that, right? It's just a number in paper. So how can it actually matter how much of it is out there? Things should adjust. So you can say all of this, and then there's all these things about the multipliers. Nobody knows what the multipliers are. There's all these leakages. As I said previously, these are complex decisions. We don't understand fully, you know, how they're all going to interlock every time we engage in some policy. And as it happens, at the end of the day, if you know, when you're thinking about the efficacy of policy, your politics probably creep into it a little bit too. So what I mean by that is, if you tend to be conservative and a believer in markets and a non-believer in government, well, then you probably would say something like, policy is not that useful. Let the economy adjust on its own, right? That's better. If you flip that around and you say, I don't trust markets, you know, CEOs, price gouging, all that stuff, I don't believe that they do things at all well. I think that, you know, there is roles for intervention, and that way I'm more amenable to this idea that we can manipulate the economy and get it to potential. So whenever you see these discussions about big economic policy and the economists are arguing, well, in all likelihood it has something to do with their feelings about those things that I just described. So adjustment process. Let's think about this a little bit more seriously, or we'll think about it from a different angle and seriously, and we'll think about this question here that I have for you. So you're a worker at a firm, and you're making, say, $25 an hour. That's not important. And you see on the news, you know, you happen to see that, well, it looks like the Federal Reserve is expanding the money supply and lowering interest rates. And so now that you've had this lecture, you understand what that's about. You're saying, all right, well, they're trying to expand aggregate demand. I understand what that means. It means aggregate demand will go up. There'll be a little pressure on prices, but business will be good. Prices will go up, business will be good, right? Of course, that's going to impact me as a worker. And there's a couple of things you can do. There's a couple of attitudes you can have to this. You can say, oh, whatever, you know, I'm happy to understand something, you know, I learned it in class. I see what's going on. Oh, well, back to work. You could do that. Or you could say, wow, this means that, you know, it means maybe the economy is going to be good going forward. That's going to be great for the business, right? You know, the boss will be making some extra money. Wonderful. Congratulations, boss, right? I understand it looks like your demand is, other things equal, going to be high in coming months or whatever, right? But then maybe you have in your mind this thing that I think I snuck it past you a couple classes ago. I said that when the economy is booming, in some sense, right, you are underpaid. Why is that the case? Well, because there's more aggregate demand, prices are up a little bit, right? Or prices are up, yet your wage has not changed, right? Things are more expensive, yet your wage has not changed. Remember, your wage is one of those input prices, right? And that's how we kept that supply curve in fixed position, to get the change in output. Well, maybe you say to your boss, you say, I know what's going to happen here. It's going to be great, we're going to have good business, but things are going to be more expensive. when the Fed institutes this change next month, you know what? Why don't we increase my wage then, right? So next month, boss, give me a 50-cent an hour raise. The boss says, okay, why not? That's fair, right? I'm rational, you're rational, we're all rational here, it's economics. We can do that, right? But now what's happened here is the Fed has announced its change. Maybe it's going to happen a couple weeks or maybe a couple days, whatever. And you've planned, right, ahead for this change by changing your wage proactively, right? Well, now what happens to our cute little diagram here? Uh-oh. Did I do this upside down? I'll turn that off in a second. Well, our diagram now has kind of an interesting property where before we might say, if we were starting at potential, right? Here's aggregate demand, aggregate supply, right? And we're starting at potential here, so we might have something about that to say later. The government or the Fed is planning to decrease interest rates, or actually easy money to decrease interest rates. That's supposed to shift out aggregate demand like that and maybe increase output. And that's going to happen when they get their policy through. But as intelligent, forward-looking, proactive workers, we've anticipated what this is going to mean for us. And as a result, we've planned for higher wages. So does the economy ever get here? No. Instead of going there, it goes right here. Because as soon as demand shifts, supply shifts as well, right? Put another way, our wage changes along with the change in demand. So now you can see, what has the Fed done? It's done absolutely nothing but increase the price level, right? Pure inflation. That's not good. We're trying to help people here. We're trying to make the economy perform better than it might be performing. And because people have foreseen what this might mean for them, they plan ahead, and now the whole benefit of our policy goes away, and we've done nothing but create something that we don't want, which is inflation. That's a little bit of a dim realization. And you might say, well, does that stuff really happen? And it turns out there's a lot of evidence that these sorts of things do happen on a macro scale. That is to say, people do have rationally formed, as we call them, expectations about the future, and they very often anticipate what our policy is trying to do, and in so doing, they negate the benefit of the policy, right? So if people see what you're trying to do, in some sense you're trying to trick them, right? We're trying to get workers to have lower real wages maybe. They see it coming and they adapt. And these sorts of reactions negate the benefit of the policy, right? And so this was a big realization that economists had in the 60s and 70s, and it kind of turned the whole policy thing on its head, right? It says the only way we can get any traction is by tricking people. That's not great. And so this, by the way, I often say this, and I don't think anybody listens, but you have to because it's my class. I often say that when you're a PhD economist and you're doing the sophisticated math, you really become an economist when you start thinking about these forward-looking expectations that people have in your model. So why do I say this? Because periodically, we learn a lot of math and we fiddle with equations and all that, and you encounter other people who do the same, who invariably think you're, they kind of look down at you because you're an economist. Physicists say, right? So physicists say, well, we understand nonlinear dynamical systems, right? And that's all you're really studying with an economy is a nonlinear dynamical system. We have fluid dynamics and particle dynamics and all that stuff. And I say that's not exactly right, because in our system, the particles in the fluid, they look ahead, right? They anticipate collisions and they move out of the way, right? Your particles just ping around, and in essence, you can predict the future by just knowing what the current state is, right? In economics, you can't do that. You have to say, well, this is where the system is. It could be going this way, but everybody in the system knows where it could be going. That makes for a lot of weird sort of behavior. Very difficult math, by the way, because it's going backwards and forwards, right? So if you think about capital, for example, the amount of machinery a business has, well, that depends not only on what they've done in the past, but also what they think is going to happen in the future, right? So it has this backward-looking and forward-looking element that are operative at the same time. It makes things very challenging, but also very interesting. Now, the basic principle, we call this rational expectations. There's been multiple Nobel Prizes won for this. It's important for macroeconomics, but it's also maybe the key feature of financial markets in understanding securities and asset prices, right? That is to say, and we'll talk about this next time, when you look at your typical asset price or the Dow Jones, it kind of trends in a direction over time, but it tends to bounce up and down more or less randomly, right? Well, next time we'll talk a little bit about that, and we'll talk about why that is the case. We'll leave that for next time. Suffice it to say, it's an important idea that has implications for our macro policy and also for other sorts of things. So I guess it'll be our last lecture next time, and I will, have a good weekend. I will see you then.